Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to all of those of you around the world in our Zoom room and Facebook Live. My name is Professor Hisham Hanna. I'm the director of the Institute for Global Innovation, the IGI, and an academic head and neck surgeon here at the University of Birmingham. The IGI is a signature institute for the university. We aim to inspire and deliver world-leading multidisciplinary research that finds solutions to the world's most pressing challenges. And we do that by bringing together teams of researchers from different disciplines, each team looking at a specific challenge. Our main themes are gender inequality, transnational crime, resilient cities, and safe and reliable water, as well as clean air, aging and frailty, and antimicrobial resistance. The COVID-19 pandemic is one of the biggest challenges that the global community has faced in recent times. And our research teams at the IGI and in the university have a key role in playing in the struggle against the COVID-19 pandemic, examining all its aspects, all the aspects on our lives, finding solutions for the challenges that are arising. At the IGI, we've also started some specific initiatives on COVID-19. One is called the COVID Corpus, an international database of all the ongoing research on COVID, all different types of research, not just medical, but also social, economic, etc. And the aim is to help researchers and funders avoid duplication and to facilitate collaboration between researchers across the world. And of course, we've also started this series of online events called Living with the Pandemic, where we bring together panels of our experts who will give a short talk about their research and perspectives on different aspects of living with the pandemic, followed by your chance to ask the panel questions. Today is the second of these sessions or series, and it's about essentially the easing of the lockdown. What are the risks and how can we avoid them? There will be three 10-minute presentations. I'm pretty strict with time, and I've told our panel that I will interrupt after 10 minutes. And the reason for that is that I'd like to allow about 20 minutes for you to ask questions. So please send us your questions through the Zoom room Q&A function and through Facebook. And we'll endeavor to answer as many as we can. Also, please follow us on Twitter at bigideas_UOB. So now I'd like to welcome our speakers. We've got a great lineup for you today. But first, Professor Dominique Moran, who's my co-chair and the deputy director of the IGI. Dom will take over if I drop out or pass out, and will also be selecting the questions that you send through. And then to our speakers. Our first speaker is Professor John Bryson. John is Professor of Enterprise and Economic Geography at Birmingham Business School. His research interests include understanding rapid adaptation during times of disruptive and radical change, including citizen-led end-user innovation and the development of alternative solutions in response to private and public sector failure. That's taken a long time to say, but John is a very clever person, and he covers a lot of things in his work. Our second speaker is Professor Willem van Schaik. Willem is professor of microbiology and infection and has been studying the biology and genomics of microbes for 20 years. In March this year, Willem was amongst the first scientists to speak out when the government was slow to implement social distancing to stop the spread of COVID-19. So welcome, Willem. And last but not least, Professor Heather Widdows. Heather is the John Ferguson Professor of Global Ethics in the Department of Philosophy. She served on the Nuffield Council on Bioethics for 6 years, up till 2020, And before that, she was a member of the UK Biobank's Ethical and Governance Council, again for many years. Thank you, Heather, for joining us. So without further ado, John, I think we'll start with you. So over to you, please.
Right, very many thanks. I'm just going to start sharing my screen with you. Right, so you should have a shared screen. So I hold the chair in Enterprise and Economic Geography at the University of Birmingham, and I'm interested in city regions and the development of an integrated approach to city regions. And I'm interested in radical change and rapid change and bricolage and improvisation, the ways in which individuals, households, firms and sectors and governments respond rapidly to change. So my presentation comes from a blog that I put up online at the University of Birmingham in very early March 2020 on social distancing and understanding some of the dimensions of social distancing. Now, my presentation has to start with the one thing that a pandemic has this sort of narrative about, which is the R0 value, or the reproduction rate of a virus. You can't talk about a pandemic, you can't understand a pandemic without understanding the reproduction number. Now, the reproduction number, you can think about it using the acronym DOTS. It involves the duration of the virus, or the infection period, the length of time a person with the virus is going to be infectious, 5 days, 4 days, 12 days. The opportunity, the contact rate, the number of social interactions a typical infected person should engage in. So if I meet someone, what's the likelihood that I'm going to spread the virus to somebody else? The transmission rate, the value that defines how the virus is going to be transmitted between people, between infected and uninfected people. And then the susceptibility rate, which is how immune the population is. Now, with COVID-19, the problem we have is we can't alter the duration or the infectious period. We can't alter the susceptibility period unless we're going to have various forms of immunity within the population if we have a viable vaccine. So what we can do is alter the opportunity and then transmission. And this is where social distancing comes in. This is where all the interventions that the various governments and countries around the world have been trying to do. And with COVID-19, when I first wrote about the R0 value for COVID-19, we were talking about an R value of 2.5. So what that means is that every person who is infected may transmit that infection to 2.5 people in the population. Now, the latest research on the R0 for COVID-19 is that it is a median of 5.7. Now, place that in context in that the flu pandemic of 1918, that R0 factor was somewhere between 1.4 and 2.8. So if COVID-19 is median 5.7, we have a significant problem within our wider population in terms of controlling transmission. Now, the problem we have with social distancing is the problem that all social scientists have and all governments have and all employers have: people. How do you manage people? How do you persuade people to develop a responsible approach to a crisis? Now, here we have a causation issue. So COVID-19 is an issue about probabilistic causation. So what this means is that if I go and break social distancing, I may cause an infection, but I may not. What we really need is something which is a more direct form of causation. So I go along and visit Hisham face to face, and 10 minutes later, Hisham's dead. So me going to visit Hisham is going to be really quite an unlikely effect. So persuading people that they may be causing a problem and they need to take social distancing seriously is a real challenge. Now, the problem is people tend not to act rationally. They tend to respond on the basis of habit, routine, and repetition. And many people think that COVID-19 is not going to have any impact upon them. So governments need to project consistent messages. They need to nudge us to alter our behavior. They need to try and highlight the relationship between cause and effect and what inappropriate social distancing might do to viral transmission. So how do we get to responsible versus irresponsible behavior with COVID-19? Now, here we have two images. So Dorset last weekend. We have an interesting issue of inappropriate or irresponsible social distancing. Vast crowd of people coming along to enjoy what was left of the British summer last Saturday. A whole series of people were injured as they were trying to engage in all sorts of inappropriate activity in the sea, but we have a potential opportunity for mass transmission of COVID-19. We just needed 1 or 2 people to be infected, to walk through that particular crowd, to cough and spread the virus, and we would have an interesting issue. We then have Dominic Cummings. Now, I've been ignoring the Dominic Cummings media story on the grounds that the Dominic Cummings media story is the wrong story. So what is the right story about Dominic Cummings? So Dominic engaged in some foolish behavior by traveling a long distance. So traveling a long distance means that if his car broke down, he would have then put these security services at potential risk, those that were going to recover him. Now, if you look at the photograph here, what we have is the press pack. Now, the press pack here is not socially distant. We have a series of individuals in London who are heavily connected across the city, and that particular group of journalists and photographers, they are a prime source of COVID-19 transmission. So the correct interpretation of the Cummings story is not about Cummings making an inappropriate decision, but it's about the irresponsibility of the British press and the way in which the British press and the journalists are acting to spread virus around London and the southeast. So if we think about COVID-19, the latest paper published in July in the Journal of Emerging of Infectious Diseases, they identify an R factor of 5.7. And what this paper argues, the only way of controlling that is to try and get herd immunity of 82% within a population. And the only way to do that is through active surveillance, contact tracing, quarantine, and incredibly strong, effective social distancing to try and stop the virus. So coming out of COVID is an attempt to try and persuade the individual, all individuals, all households, all companies to take social distancing really seriously, because without that, we're going to see a second wave and a third wave of the pandemic. So one of the questions I'm interested in is how do we get ourselves into the COVID-19 crisis? And the answer is we didn't learn. So SARS in 2003, a pilot for COVID-19, whole series of papers published on SARS. If you look at some of the core papers on SARS and the impacts, they're cited 12 or 13 times. So what we need to make sure with COVID-19 that we do learn and we do alter our behavior radically and rapidly. And then for the UK, last year, I held a series of workshops in the United States in which I got shouted down by my social science colleagues because what I was doing was predicting a pandemic. And I was arguing we're going to have a pandemic that was going to shut down the global economy. And everybody says, no, that's not going to happen. And then over the last couple of months, I had a series of emails from American colleagues who attended those workshops saying, you were right, you were scarily right. So my current prediction is expect future pandemics. We are going to get an awful lot more. And the reason why we're going to get an awful lot more is increasing density of the human population and increasing connectivity. Now, for the United Kingdom, one of the interesting figures is that Britons travel more than any other nationality. So in 2018, 8.6% of all the people who were flying were British. Next in line was the United States and then China. Now that level of connectivity means that we are exposed to the rapid transmission of viruses across the world incredibly rapidly. Now the final point I want to remind you about is that the social distancing economy we're currently entering, there are people who will benefit and people who will lose. The people who will benefit are those who can cope and survive within this new socially distanced economy. Those who are engaging in face-to-face activities and occupations are going to be more vulnerable. My final slide is just to highlight that I have 3 published papers in press that are dealing with various aspects of COVID-19. One paper, the Town Planning Review paper, is about how do you plan African cities to reduce disease transmission. The second paper is about reducing risk within value chains. And the third paper is about radical improvisation amongst British churches as they went from being face-to-face church services to virtual services. That's the end of my presentation. I'm going to hand back to Hisham in central control at IGI, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, John. Fascinating insights. Thank you very much. Now, It's a pleasure to ask Willem to give his talk. So please, Willem, if you can give your talk. Thank you. Willem, if you can switch on your...
Sorry. Thank you very much, Hisham, for that introduction. So I'll be talking about COVID-19 and lessons that we can learn from other countries that are ahead of us in the epidemic curve. So I'm going to give a very short overview of COVID-19 in Europe, and then the lessons that we can learn from other countries. And I'm sure that many of you have seen graphs like these before about the number of deaths that are attributed to COVID-19 across the continent. And it's one of the things that's immediately obvious in graphs like these is that some countries are doing markedly better than others, even when taking into account the size of a country. Like the population of Germany is roughly the same as the population of the United Kingdom, but clearly the number of cases of COVID-19 is a lot lower in Germany than it is in the UK. And I think that there's a lot to be learned from how successful countries like Germany, Austria, and Denmark are now also releasing lockdown, and I will be covering that in this presentation. But first I want you to look at this figure, which I think is actually, I'm just putting this in to emphasize what an incredible crisis we are going through. So this is an overview of the excess mortality in Europe over a 4-year period since early 2016. And you can see that there's always this sort of shape of the curve where there is seasonal flu around the start of every year, which leads to an excess death during the year. But this peak clearly is significantly higher. So this is the COVID-19 peak is clearly higher, and it would have gone much higher than this if not practically all countries in Europe had done some interventions to stop the spread of COVID-19. And that now the excess mortality is going back to more or less normal levels, but of course there is this risk for a second wave. If you split out that excess mortality across different age groups, there's something that, again, many of you will know, and that's that older individuals are at a higher risk of dying from COVID-19. But the point that I want to make here that children, so those under 14, actually have no additional risk. There's absolutely no evidence here that there is an increased risk of death due to COVID-19 in young children. But actually, young adults are at an increased risk. So we can see that the excess mortality is higher than would normally be seen in this population. And of course, this should inform decisions on what to do with lockdown. So all governments across Europe are following essentially the same strategy for releasing lockdown. And that's that it's a gradual process, and that people have to adapt to a new normal. Social distancing will still need to be in place, and people have to adapt to that. Life for some time will be quite different from what we're used to. I want to cover just one aspect of releasing lockdown, and that's the concept of children and schools, and how we can, how other countries are reopening schools safely, and then some other insights that I want to share with you. So there's quite a bit known. I've already shown you that graph with excess mortality, and so it's very clear that serious disease is extremely rare among children. And children are not thought to play a major role in COVID-19 transmission. There's no outbreaks that are really particularly large that are associated, for example, with schools or other places where there's many children. But of course, there's many uncertainties in this aspect, as there are so many uncertainties in COVID-19 in general. And the reason why governments have closed schools may actually not be to lower the number of contacts of children, but also of adults who are at a much higher risk of transmitting the disease, but also of developing serious disease. And this is something that is sometimes overlooked. When children stay at home, their parents do not go out as much as they used to do. Also, teachers do not have to travel. They do not have to go to school. So this will minimize the number of contacts. And that is one of the reasons why school closures already in the Spanish flu outbreak in 1918, 1919 was used as a measure to minimize the transmission of flu during that time. So of course, closing schools has major social consequences. For example, there's an educational attainment gap will become larger in many countries, and obviously this will have very serious effects along the line. So this is also one of the reasons why many countries are now working to reopen schools. So far, this has gone reasonably well across the continent. So many countries have put in specific precautions, like, for example, putting in 50% attendance to retain social distancing. And this has, in some cases, led to a small and most of the time only temporary increase in the R rate, but it's still below 1 in almost every country in Europe that as far as I'm aware. So a very country that has done extremely well in terms of COVID-19 is Austria, which is actually kind of surprising when you think of it, because it's close to Italy, which was the epicenter of the epidemic in February of this year. So they've been able to reopen schools now for about 3 weeks, and that has only led to a handful of extra cases, no large outbreaks. For example, they've had 4 cases in schools across Vienna, the capital of Austria, per week. And there has not been any evidence that it has led to sustained transmission of COVID-19. And the reason why the Austrians have been able to do this is because they have been able to rapidly test any cases that were suspected of having COVID-19. They try to implement social distancing in their schools, even though, of course, with younger children, that is very difficult. And initially, they also required the children to wear face masks. But I think they've now decided that's actually not being helpful, or face masks the compliance was very low, and that's why it's no longer required since the 1st of June. And of course, we're too soon in these measures to determine whether that's really going to affect the spread of COVID-19 in Austria. So if you look across Europe, so where we now see outbreak clusters, they are in different places, but they all share some aspects that makes them similar. So, for example, church services in Germany have been linked to outbreaks. Mail sorting offices in Austria, meat processing plants in the Netherlands and Germany, restaurants and shisha bars, both in Germany, particularly when, for example, there were illegal parties in these places where social distancing broke down entirely. And unfortunately, care homes in all these countries are still at a very high risk of developing outbreaks. And of course, all of these can lead to local return to lockdown or school closures to minimize, again, and to basically keep people in their homes. And this is not to test your knowledge of German, but this is something that was published yesterday about a corona outbreak in the German university town of Göttingen, where they had an outbreak linked to one of these shisha bars. And as a precautionary measures, they basically closed down all the schools until the weekend. And I think that is something that we'll probably see in more countries when there are local outbreaks of COVID-19. So a couple of lessons to learn from other countries. And I think John also mentioned this. So it's very important to have clear and unambiguous communication. I really liked how Japan has done a communication in terms of the spread of COVID-19. This is the English version version of a poster that they published some weeks ago already, where it asked people to avoid the 3 C's, so closed spaces, crowded spaces, and close contact settings, and particularly where these 3 C's coincide. And I think this is particularly clear communication and unambiguous. The other point that some countries are implementing is travel restrictions, but it only works if local numbers of cases are low. So this is a map from the Czech government. The Czech Republic has also done really well in containing COVID-19. And this is a map of countries that they are comfortable with having tourists come to the Czech Republic without any further testing. So the countries in green do not need any testing to visit the Czech Republic. The countries in yellow and obviously in red, which are seen as high-risk countries, are countries where there's still more transmission. The number of cases is higher, significantly higher than in the Czech Republic. So there's a risk of importation of cases into the Czech Republic. This also means that in a country like the UK, where the number of cases are considerably higher than in other countries across the world, it doesn't really make much sense right now to implement travel restrictions. Indeed, if we would bring people from the Czech Republic, for example, into the UK, we would actually slowly dilute the number of COVID-19 cases that we have in the country. And then as a final point, and this is also a lesson that many countries have learned by now. So if you want to release lockdown, you need to have efficient testing and a tracing infrastructure, a tracing of contacts, so that you can contact people that have transmitted the disease to each other. And you can do that, let's say, very almost old-fashioned way by simply phoning people and asking them if they have symptoms, and if they need to quarantine, if they do, they need to quarantine or they need to be tested. But you can also use app-based tracing, which is still very much in development, and which the next speaker, Professor Heather Widdows, will discuss in more details. And I would like to leave it at that. Thank you very much, Hisham.
Thank you very much, Willem. Really interesting lessons there, which we'll come back to. And so now, if I may ask Heather, if you could take over. Thank you very much.
No problem. This is where I try and share my screen. Okay, so some of you may have read the brief that me and my colleague Jean McHale wrote, I think last week. There's us looking a little less dishevelled from than we are in lockdown life. And really, the messages that we gave there are the messages that I just want to return to and maybe give some more detail on. So the main point of the brief is that if you want to track, trace and contain the virus using an app, you just don't need a centralized app. You do not need to hold central data to do that job. So given the ethical and legal worries, then the real question, the single take-home message of our brief was, why use this one when we don't have to? The ethical and legal issues that we are worried about are this list. So we're worried about privacy. When you download the app, you download your postcode, and of course, if you develop symptoms, then you say so and you get phoned up, etc. So obviously you're identifiable. But the real issue about privacy is that they're talking about holding this data for 5 years if you then don't go on to test positive, and up to 20 years if you do. Now, so the amount of time in which identification is possible is really quite extensive, and identification always happens when you triangulate or you compare to another database. And there's also worries, and this is something that very many scientists have been concerned about and writing open letters to various European governments about, is the surveillance and mission creep that's implied by this kind of data capture. A second issue is about just what the data is going to be used for and used for in the future. Remember the kind of 20-year horizon. And there's a question about whether actually data for future research is a motivation as much as containing the virus. Something I'm going to talk about quite a lot is the issue of consent, right? Consent is usually the ethical value that we use when we regulate research, and it's completely missing from the government's discussion about this. The fact that we voluntarily download the app is certainly not consent to our data being used for all kinds of future research of which we are not yet aware. So while exceptional times do call for exceptional measures, they need to be proportional to the extent of the emergency. And it's not obvious that that data needs to be held beyond the emergency. Indeed, that's what the Joint Commission for Human Rights has requested. And then also the messages that were being given, if you want clear messaging, we're not being given clear messaging about this. We're being told to download the app to help the NHS. And this looks like suspiciously like a way of inducing us to do this. The stated aim of the app is to minimise the spread of COVID-19 and move towards reducing the lockdown measures. And that's the message that's come out very, very strongly about the use of the app. Although it has gone a little bit quieter over the last couple of weeks, so maybe it didn't go so well or not as well as we've been led to believe. So in order to reassure us, the government has adopted these 6 principles, which were given to them by the Ethics Advisory Board, which is an advisory group about which, again, we've heard very, very little. So these principles, the Ethics Advisory Board gave their conditional support to the use of the app if these principles were adhered to. And quite interestingly, they stated, and I quote, that they would conditionally support on the information we have available to us at this point in time. And there's been some discussion in the national press about whether, in fact, the board itself is split. And might well they be split because these are really quite odd ethical principles, right? So the first one is value, right? There needs to be enough benefit for society in general to justify, and again, I quote, any adverse consequences to individuals. So right, we're anticipating adverse consequences, or that wouldn't be there. Impact, that we need to know it's going to be an effective tool. Security and privacy, right? The data collected should be minimised and protected. Well, arguably we've already broken this principle, because if we wanted to minimise data collection, we wouldn't use a centralised app at all. Accountability, there needs to be a reliable, understandable decision-making process. Well, we certainly don't have that because we don't know why we're using this app and not a decentralised app. Transparency, again, there are real worries about the lack of this. And the last principle of control is a really interestingly worded principle. So users should be able to see what data is held about them so they can understand how it is impacting on decisions. Well, that doesn't sound like control, right? Understanding how your data is being used is not the same as controlling it. So these principles are at best ambiguous and opaque and vague. We may already have broken them. And if we haven't broken them, then it's hard to see what teeth they have. What does it require or prevent? So the second aim of the app that the government quite clearly states, but has not been publicised very much, is that it is a means to collect additional data in a privacy-safe way for use by the NHS and public health to better understand COVID-19 and to manage the pandemic. Which again begs the question about, really, is that all? Because if you're keeping for 20 years, that doesn't look like all that's going on. And the language about research is not focused on the pandemic, it's focused on research in general. And throughout the document, the language of donation is given, not languages about research participation. And obviously when you donate, it is a gift. By definition, when you give something, you hand it over for the other person to use as they see fit. It is a giving up of control. So this is the exact wording in the document. Users may give specific agreement to voluntarily provide additional data. Agreement will be sought from people who are willing to donate their data for research. The data that is donated for research will only be available to those who have been approved by the NHS, so approved by the NHS. And again, the Joint Commission on Human Rights pointed out that that actually opens the door for the data to be used in general. The key question for an ethicist is what's happened to consent? Why is consent missing in action? It's not mentioned at all in the government response. And they seem to be using the fact that you voluntarily download the app, perhaps for one purpose, as consent for your data to be used in what are potentially a whole range of ways. And it's never been the case in any research ethics. You can do proxy consent by the fact that you voluntarily act in some way. Right? That is not how we normally do consent in any context. So the Ethics Advisory Board does mention consent in their document, but again, they do it in a really unusual way. They talk about broader societal consent, which is not a standard understanding of consent, right? Usually you consent to the use of your own tissue or your own data. And we're not even sure what that might mean, right? So can there be sort of general public consent of the British public to use my, Heather's, personal data and data that may tell you about those related to me? And what if there are downstream harms, right? There's a whole load of potential discrimination that follows from this if it turns out that I or those related to me are particularly susceptible to COVID-19. We don't know what kind of harms will accrue going forward. There could be issues about employability or insurance and all kinds of discrimination issues going forward. And also it's a valuable data set. So should those who contribute it have no control over who profits from it or what it's used for? And if you remember the donation language, it currently looks like that is not envisaged. So for consent to be valid, we normally think that it has to be informed. Now, for obvious reasons, it is impossible to be informed about future research. It's unknown. That's the bottom line about future research. So the code that governs global research says that informed consent must be informed of the aims, methods, sources of funding, any possible conflicts of interest, institutional affiliations of the research, anticipated benefits, and the list goes on. Now, of course, it's impossible to give informed consent about unknown future research by unknown future researchers. So there are ways that we get around this, right? You can do other things in addition to or instead of consent. So either you can have additional safeguards or governance mechanisms to ensure that there are protections and mitigations against future harms. So you need a mechanism by which, if those kind of harms ensue, you can do other things to mitigate them. Or, and this is what happens in a lot of studies, you return to participants and ask their consent to be part of future research once you know what that is. So we're not doing the normal things that we would do to ensure that research going forward is ethical. And we're doing a lot of it under the cover of the NHS, right? So the British public have very strong emotional attachment to the NHS. So we may underfund it, we may arguably privatise it by the back door, but politicians don't say things like that because the NHS is about winning. Remember the Olympic Games and the opening, right? So even more that is true at the current context when the NHS are our heroes and our key workers. So the British public may be much less comfortable about giving data to future unknown researchers than they are to downloading an app to help the NHS. And then the final point is about being again an outlier in Europe. So only the UK, France and Norway are even considering a centralised app, and there's a much more public debate about the issues of privacy and other concerns in those countries than there is in the UK right now. Germany, in fact, did a U-turn. It was going to use a centralised app, and then for these reasons, it decided not to and went for a decentralised app. And then there's also a really practical reason, right? Lots of countries are going for the decentralised apps. Decentralised apps speak to each other. By definition, a centralised app is a national app. The data is stored centrally by the NHS, Public Health England, etc. It doesn't speak to other apps. And COVID-19 is the epitome of a global problem. Global problems need global solutions. So to sum up, we, the British public, we don't need a centralised app if what we want to do is track, trace and contain. They, whoever they are, and part of the problem is we don't know who they are or will be, do need a centralised app if they're doing a data grab. And one that we're more likely to accept if we think this is going to help the NHS. So there's real ethical worries about privacy, data use, the lack and impossibility of valid consent. And very practically, the centralised app won't speak to other apps, so it's likely to be less effective as well as less ethical. And I should now hand back to Hisham. I think I'm 30 seconds over.
Thank you very much. That was a great talk and a worrying talk too, Heather. So thank you. So now we'll bring up all the panelists, and John, if we can see you as well, that'd be great. So I've got lots of questions coming up. Heather, whilst we're on the issue of privacy, we had a couple of questions, one from Eva Sayers and one from Anna Libra and one from Anonymous. Asking about what's the difference between a centralized app and a non-centralized app. And as far as we understand, the non-centralized apps are like Apple and Google, do they have any, are there any concerns with them? So if you could please answer that.
Right, so the basic difference is just that the decentralized app holds no data in any central database at all. The data is stored on the phone and then it leaves the phone. So, you might have conspiracy theories about Apple and Google, and as a global ethicist, you can imagine that I'm not always the biggest fan of big international corporations. But in this instance, it's the very fact that you centrally hold data on a database and then use it for other things and compare it against other databases, always going to have the potential to be identifying, compared to a decentralized app where it is only on the phone and then it goes.
And do you have any, are there any specific worries about decentralized apps?
There are much less so. So obviously I'm an ethicist and not a computer scientist. So, it seems like it's very much less likely that will be stored and used, and certainly it won't be collated and have profit in it, and the identifying nature of it just doesn't maintain. So, some of the people defending this have made examples like, oh, well, you give your data to store cars and that's how centrally, right? And all that's true, right? We might have big privacy concerns about that, and much more so than we would about other things. But when you're talking about medical data, and particularly data of this sort, which, personal data, when it's connected to medical data, and particularly in the genetic era, has long-term ability to be identifying not just of you, but also of those related to you. So the information that you're giving out is potentially valuable for a very long time, and not just of you, but of family members going forward. So it's a very different thing than giving out, your preferences for Rice Krispies, for instance. And I'm not trying to generate what you can do with that information, but there are really serious issues about long-term identification from medical information that will lead to discrimination, insurance companies, employability, who's allowed to go where. So we've had a lot of talk about immunity passports, with very little thought about the injustice in that. Certain sectors of society where automatically struggle, where we've seen in COVID inequalities coming to the fore very dramatically, as who dies, who gets ill, who can survive well in this, and none of that is being taken into account.
Great, and I don't want to spend all the time on the centralized versus non-centralized app, but there's a follow-up question from Ed Smith. Would you say the approach is centralized? It's a controversial question. So is it centralized, do you think, simply due to incompetence and the fact that the history of the NHS has been about central control and micromanagement rather than a deliberate ploy to access and misuse data?
I don't know. I do think that I don't think it can be just that, because of the way that the rest of Europe is responding. We are an outlier there, and those debates are not being aired in the UK in the way that they are elsewhere. And in fact, they're sort of being poo-pooed and dismissed as if, how dare you raise that? It's an emergency. This is really important. And everybody agrees this is an emergency, and tracking and tracing effectively is really important. But to dismiss those concerns and to talk about keeping data for 5 to 20 years, right? This is really extreme. So I don't think this is just like, oh, it's just the way the NHS has done things. I don't think that's true at all. I think there is a real wish to grab data. Now, that may be for well-meaning reasons, right? The more data we have, then the more we can know, but it may not be considering the other issues of inequality and personal data, and, moving into a world where this kind of discrimination, assuming there is no vaccine and things go on, may actually bar certain groups quite clearly from certain kinds of professions and access to other goods.
Great, thank you very much. That's very clear and a very interesting perspective, actually, especially that last response. John, if I may ask you, we had a couple of questions, one from Alexander Brun and a couple of other questions about the R0 value of 5.7. Is that the international median, or is it the median for the UK? And is that when it was before lockdown? So just to clarify the 5.7, because some people are confused. They're saying, well, we thought the R0 currently in the UK is 0.7 to 0.9. So if you could clarify that, please.
Right, so let me just follow up from the last question. So first comment on the last question is the history of the UK is during crisis we go into centralized systems. So if you think back to all of the major crises, there's a lockdown, there's a centralization, that is the UK response to crisis. And the history of that response is that once it's being centralized, it's never decentralized. So once it's occurred, getting an alternative solution is a real problem. Now, the reproduction rate figure, I was guilty of making an assumption over how people would understand what I was saying. So the R5.7 figure is coming from some American work based on the Chinese data. And what the paper is saying is that if you just let the virus roll forward throughout a population, you will have an R factor of 5.7. So social distancing and all of the attempts to alter human behaviors to try to bring that below 1. If you bring it below 1, the virus will not be reproducing within the population. If you have it above 1, it will be reproducing. If you have it at 5.7, you've got a major problem.
Great, great. That makes sense. And following on, on that, Willem, I wanted to ask you, Sweden's had a very different strategy. Mm-hmm. What do you think of that strategy? Has it worked in your view? And what can we learn from that?
I'm afraid what we can learn from it is how not to do these things. So to some extent, Sweden's strategy has been started out well. I think there's a real point to be made that having very strict lockdown measures is not necessarily what you want to have. You want to start gently and then build it up slowly, which has not happened in this country, and so that's why we suddenly had to hit the pause button with the lockdown on the 23rd of March. But Sweden basically started out very slowly in their response, and they didn't act on when they saw that there was a massive problem with the virus spreading in care homes, which is, I would say, perfectly, which is something that you can expect to happen with a virus like COVID-19, which is something that you can expect from happening from the data that we had in January and February. So Sweden has chosen a route that I would not have chosen, and it is clear that on a per capita basis, the number of deaths is now, I think, the highest in the world. And even the country's lead epidemiologist this morning had to admit that mistakes had been made and they probably should have done something differently. And I and many of my colleagues have been saying this for months already, that they were following a very different strategy. Some people say that they do this to protect their economy. And just to clarify this, the Swedish National Bank is expecting a 7.7% contraction of GDP this year. So even though they have a very high number of deaths, they have not protected the economy in any way that's more better than many other countries.
Well, thank you. That's a really interesting answer and very clear. And moving from that to the UK response. So Alexandros has asked, the debate about the UK response has been riddled with political biases, and was it right? Was it wrong? Were we too late? Were we not too late? That aside, do you think we're ready now in the UK for releasing lockdown as a scientist?
No, I understand. I don't have a British passport, so I can't even vote in this country. We are in a situation that's very different from a country like Germany or even France, because we have a lot more community transmission of COVID-19 than other countries. So you take a lot more risks in releasing lockdown, because if only a few of these people start spreading, then you start to look at large numbers of patients coming into hospitals very quickly again. And so it is. I'm not entirely sure whether now is the right time to exit from lockdown, but I do of course see why at some point you want to do that, right? My concern is that we don't really have that testing and tracing infrastructure. We might have the testing infrastructure, but the tracing infrastructure is the one that really worries me, not just for the ethical concerns about the NHS X app, but also just the shoe leather epidemiology is just not there. And that gives an opportunity for the virus to spread undetected, and then we can have a high number of cases in a very short period of time.
And so, putting you on the spot, do you think there's going to be a second wave? And if so, how big? And then I'll come to John to answer that question also.
It very much depends on how I think maybe John is even better in answering this question, because it very much depends on the behavior of people. If the population as a whole behaves responsibly, then there might be a second wave, but it will be quite low. If people think that they can go back to life as it was in January, February this year, yes, then there will be a massive second wave.
Okay, and John, what do you think?
Right, okay, so I'm going to be very pessimistic here and say there will definitely be a second wave. And there will be another pandemic, COVID 2022 or 2024. And the reason why I say we will have a second wave, we open our garden as part of the National Garden Scheme. And we were meant to be opening in late May. We were closed because we don't have insurance for covering open to the public. We had all over the garden closure, closure, closure. The doors and the gates to the garden were closed and sealed. A couple turned up saying, could they have a look around? And we said, no, we're closed. And we said, what about social distancing? And saying, well, no one's doing that anymore. That's finished. Now, the problem we have is the British press. So the British press, when did they start talking about the reproduction number? In very late March, early April, really, really late in the day. If you go to the Irish Republic, what you see is 2 meter long signs saying this is 2 meters long distance. Go to the UK, you have A4 papers saying think of about 2 meters. So there's an educational issue with the British press. When we began to relax social distancing, the British press was it's confused. So the message is confused. The Irish press was, this is what you need to do. Really clearly precise. You do this, you don't do something else. So what we have within the British press is they're busy trying to identify errors and political errors that they're busy trying to blame. But what they're not doing is producing a clear, consistent message. This is what you need to do to avoid people dying.
That's a very, you're obviously not a fan of the British press. So moving on to another question to you. You talked about predicting that there was going to be a pandemic and learning from the previous pandemics, and that we didn't actually learn from the previous pandemics. What would you say are the top 3 lessons in your estimation, or in your mind, that we could have learned from those previous pandemics?
Right, so you're asking me a typical Bryson question during an interview, 3 things. So you have to be really well controlled and structured in your answer. So I do have a paper on this, which is coming out in July. So the 3 things we should have learned: multiple sourcing of core elements needed to support the National Health Service. So you're not over-reliant on a single country. So if one single country goes down, there are alternative sourcing. Making sure that you've got sufficient local demand. So if there's nothing can come in from outside the UK, there is sufficient local demand. So the company based in Limerick that was producing masks for the Irish Health Service has quadrupled in size, from being a very small company to quite a large, medium-sized company. And the third thing is, this paper we have from Press on African cities, is the planning process is all about intensification and intensification of density within our cities. So our cities are becoming more dense. Now, that planning argument about increasing density, all that does is increase transmission opportunities. So what we need is to have a debate about how we plan our cities and our housing units. So the housing units are more suitable for social distancing and isolation, and the cities themselves are planned to reduce virus transmission. At the moment, planning doesn't even think about that as an agenda item.
Sorry, John, and you've just answered Bridget Bell's question as well in that answer about the density and the importance of density. Well, maybe one last question then. Heather, do you think this issue of consent, etc., in the app speaks to broader ethical worries about public trust and transparency? Is it part of a bigger problem that we as a British nation are worried about, or that our government, a problem with our government in explaining these things? Is there a trust issue here?
Yeah, I think that there absolutely is the trust issue, and a very fundamental one. So before I left the Nuffield Council, one of my last acts was to write with them, the whole council, like, this is an unprecedented thing that we've done, because we usually work behind the scenes with government, with ministers. We did a public open letter about just how poor we think the transparency and accountability of the decision making has been. Right, so you can follow the science all you like, but that's a relatively meaningless phrase, because when you actually make these decisions, these are political and ethical decisions. So science can advise, as the scientists have been keen to say, they can give all the kinds of information that they have to hand. But when you're making decisions between one course of action and another, those are political and ethical decisions. And we've had virtually no transparency and accountability about what those decisions are, where and when. So, you know, all of the things that John's just saying about how we plan our cities, how we go forward, what we think about travel, what we think about globalization, what we think about urban planning, those are all political and ethical calls, right? And we need to have a debate about that. To be blindly told we're following the science when policies are chopping and changing without showing the working to the British people means that they're not doing a transparent job. And whatever one thinks of the British press, it's undoubtedly the case that trust in the government has dropped dramatically over the last 10 days. That can only continue, and if we don't have trust in what we're being told to do, then that's going to impact on behaviour, and it could be catastrophic. So I do think that the failure to communicate, to be clear, to be transparent, actually comes from the top, and there's been less communication on those issues than we would normally expect in the ethics community about these issues. And I really, really worry about that. And it's not about blaming, it's about making the right decisions now. So it's not about saying, oh, you did all this wrong, right? Blaming doesn't help anybody. So maybe later down the road, there's time for an inquiry. But right now, it's about making sure that the decisions are fed into by those who understand what's at stake, and that they're done openly and transparently with proper public debate from stakeholders and not just fudged.
Great, and that has a spillover on the public trust, generally speaking, and it'd be a shame for a democracy to lose that or to erode it, as you say. Look, I'd like to really thank you all for a really, really interesting discussion and excellent presentations, really great insights. And I'd like to also thank Dom for co-chairing and for selecting all the questions. Really appreciate it, Dom. Alex Young and Sue Gilligan from the IGI for all their hard work in preparing this, and also to our colleagues in alumni and external relations and business engagement for all the work that they do to support this. And really finally, thanking you as the audience for coming and for taking the time and for the great questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't answer all your questions, but I think actually we've covered in some of the answers a lot of the questions that were asked. The team will email you all for feedback and details of our future events and how to contact us to find more about the work of the IGI. And as a reminder, please do join us and tell your friends and colleagues that the next Living with the Pandemic session is on Thursday, the 18th, again between 12 and 1, and it's on doing things differently, the new normal, and we'll be doing a couple of sessions about that. So thank you very much and look forward to seeing you again, and take care and stay well.